Hi, my name is Alyssa Kintsche, and I am a funeral director at McCausland, Garrity, Marchesani Funeral Home in Glen Olden. I got my job here at the funeral home when I was only 19. The way that I did that was through an internship. I was in college at the time and I wanted to get a little bit of experience, so I decided to apply at local funeral homes to try and get some hands-on experience. To get to that point, I started thinking of my career in high school. While I was in high school, I was drawn to business and marketing. So I took all of the classes that I could in regards to business, and I also joined all of the clubs. So I joined clubs including business club and marketing club and small business club, and those really led me to my career today. In high school, I took a personality aptitude test mandated by the school, and the first thing that came up for my personality was funeral director, which was a very strange thing to have come up on your personality aptitude test, but I was intrigued. I thought that it might be a good fit, and I had never thought of it before. So what I did is I went and got an internship at another funeral home while I was in high school. In order to do that, I applied to a local funeral home. I called and I asked if they would be willing to take a high school intern, even if it was just for a short period of time so I could learn about the business. What you don't know is many funeral directors are wonderful, caring people. That's why they have this job or this career. So they were more than happy to introduce me to the funeral industry and help me to move forward with my dream of being a funeral director. Once I found out that I was a good fit at that funeral home, I decided I was going to go to college for funeral service. Now, my path could be a little bit different than other funeral directors, but I decided that it was important to me to get a bachelor's degree prior to going to mortuary school. So mortuary school is different from actual university or actual college. You have to have an associate's degree to get into the mortuary school program. I decided that an associate's degree wasn't what I wanted to do, so I went to get a bachelor's degree first, and I went to a school in Pennsylvania that offers mortuary school as well, so that after I was done with my bachelor's, I would be more likely to get into the mortuary program. Now, I started college at Northampton University, but however, that didn't seem to be the right path for me. I had moved, and it was better for me to go to Mercer County Community College for mortuary school in New Jersey because it was a little bit closer to my home at the time. I went there, and I got my internship here at McCausland Garrity Marchesani Funeral Home, where I am now a funeral director just a few years later. In order to be a funeral director, you have to have many skills. You have to have good people skills because we are dealing with the grieving and the public and all the people in the community all the time. You also have to be sincere with your people skills. That's the most important skill. Sincerity is what people realize and what they hear, and in their time of grief, that's what they need. You also need to be understanding that people are going through a hard time and people don't have all the answers and that you are there to provide them answers. You also have to be community oriented because as a funeral director, I am in charge of a lot of community events. We run quite a few community events here, and we're always trying to find ways to help our local community. On the other hand, that also means that you have to be responsible enough to know that your community is watching you. Even if you're going to the Wawa or even if you're going to the grocery store, that you could run into somebody from the funeral home and you're representing your community. You're representing someone who they trust and who they understand. There are a lot of positives to being a funeral director, though, and one of them is that trust that people have in you, that you're going to give them answers and honesty and sincerity. But there are also a lot of cons at times. So one of the biggest cons about being a funeral director is the hours. If you're thinking of going into this business, you have to know that people could pass away at any time of day or night. So you are on call any time of day or any time of night, any holiday, any time. You never get to turn that part of you off. However, you do get to make your own hours sometimes. So sometimes you go through slower times where we don't have people passing away and you aren't necessarily needed all the time. So you do get to create your own hours sometimes. My tasks as a funeral director here at the funeral home are many. So you think of a funeral director, you may think of the person that stands up at the funeral home and makes speeches or invites people to funeral luncheons. However, I'm also responsible for removing people when they pass away. I'm responsible for meeting with families and making those arrangements for funerals. I'm responsible for embalming those bodies and doing the makeup and the hair. I'm responsible for filling out all the paperwork and getting all of the permits. I'm responsible for answering all the phone calls and all of the office work. So it really is a very busy job. It's not just working those funerals for a few hours a day. It's also doing all of the behind the scenes work and also embalming and doing things to prepare the deceased for their funeral service. Which brings us to our next point. In order to be a funeral director, you have to be okay or be comfortable around people who have passed away, because it is part of our job. We don't get to pass that off onto other people. You have to be okay with, of course, bodies and blood. It's something that we have to work with, and we have to be understanding of when people pass away, someone has to care for them and care for their bodies. Now, one thing you wouldn't necessarily have to do as a funeral director, but here at my funeral home we do, is cremations. So many funeral homes use a private crematory, meaning they take the deceased to crematories and the crematory does the cremation itself. Now, our funeral home here at McCausland Garrity Marchesani Funeral Home, we have a crematory in the building, so we are also responsible for all of our own cremations, meaning we prepare all of the bodies for cremation and we actually perform the cremation itself with a machine, which brings on a lot more paperwork and a lot more work like we discussed about. As far as salary as a funeral director, that varies. So many funeral homes are small businesses and locally owned, and their salaries could be a bit different than there are corporate funeral homes. So one of the corporate funeral homes may have many more funeral directors, meaning you might not be on call as much or you might not work as much because you have more staff. So if you work for a smaller funeral home, your salary could be quite different than if you work for a bigger funeral home or a chain of funeral homes. So they say that starting salary, of course, as a funeral director and not as an intern, starting salary is usually around $35,000 a year. Now, of course, you're open to bonuses and raises and things like that. And for smaller businesses, I would say, in my opinion, you usually top out salary-wise around $85,000. Now, at larger corporation funeral homes, you may have more room for improvement as far as salary. Now, the benefits to working for a small funeral home rather than a corporate funeral home are a small funeral home, you're responsible for your families. They know your face, they know your name, and they're comfortable using you. Whereas working for a corporation, families might not know you. They might just know the name of the funeral home, and they are just assigned to a funeral director within that funeral home. So there are two different ways to go about this. If you feel like you would fit better in an office setting where you might work with quite a few more people, you might be better off going to a corporate funeral home. If you feel like you want that relationship with your families, you may want to think about possibly working for a smaller funeral home. No matter where you work, though, whether you work at a corporate funeral home or a small funeral home, I can tell you this, that you will work with some fantastic, sincere, genuine, and thoughtful people. The people that think to work at a funeral home are people like no other. They are so sincere in that they just want to help the people that are grieving. And in turn, that means that they will be sincere, wonderful coworkers. Now, working at a funeral home, you have to learn the difference between sympathy and empathy. That's the biggest thing. You have to be able to understand people's grief, but not necessarily feel it yourself because it can be draining and it can wear you down. So you have to have compassion for those people that are mourning, but not necessarily take it home with you at the end of your workday, which is very hard when things come up like spontaneous deaths or accidents or babies. These are very, very challenging deaths, especially for the family, but even for you. So you have to understand that you have to put that aside, help them with their needs, but not necessarily bring it inside of your life. Now, being a funeral director has many, many wonderful reasons, but I urge you to look into it for yourself. If you think that you might be a good fit for this, maybe call funeral homes and see if you can get an internship, or look into schools. So a few of the schools that you could look into again are Northampton, Mercer County, Pittsburgh has one online that you could just do from home, especially during a pandemic. But really, if you really want to do this, you should be hands-on. You should ask for an internship. Ask just to shadow a funeral director. They funeral directors will see your eagerness and your willingness to help and to help the families that they're helping, and they'll appreciate that. So if you want to get started, or you think that this might be the right path for you, maybe YouTube a few things like embalming, like cremation, like what a funeral home does, and go from there. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at McCausland, Garrity, Marchesani Funeral Home, where we're always here to help. Take care.